Welcome to Truly Scary Ouija Stories. Smash like and subscribe to tread the thin line between reality and the surreal. Let's begin our eerie expedition.
The attic was cold, the kind of bone-chilling cold that seeps into your very marrow, untouched by the sporadic warmth from the flickering bulb that dangled overhead. Thunder growled in the distance, as if protesting our intrusion into the shadow-laden realm of forgotten things. Ethan's voice, both curious and commanding, shattered the silence. "Hey, what's this?" His fingers, caked with dust, wrapped around the edge of a wooden box tucked beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Mia, her heart a small drum in her chest, leaned closer. "Looks old, really old." The air thickened with the must of decay and the untold stories of decades past. With a shared glance of reckless curiosity, they summoned Lucy over, and together they opened the box to reveal a Ouija board. Its letters faded but legible, the planchette still glossy as if waiting patiently for its next game. "It's just a game, right?" Lucy's voice trembled slightly, betraying her feigned disinterest. "Only one way to find out," Mia replied, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and thrill. They set the board on an old trunk, the makeshift table between them, as the storm outside crescendoed, as if cueing their next move. Action beat 1, initial contact. The room seemed to hold its breath as their fingers collectively touched the planchette. Mia asked the first question, her voice a whisper. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette stirred, dragging their fingertips with it, haltingly at first, then with purpose. It slid across to yes. The simple affirmation sent a wave of silent panic through the trio. Ethan, face skeptical, broke the silence with a logical whisper. "It's just subconscious movements, right?" Yet, as if offended by his disbelief, the planchette moved again, this time more swiftly, spelling out, "They watch you." Action beat 2. Escalation of unsettling messages. Choked laughter escaped Ethan as he tried to lighten the mood. "Who's watching us?" "The attic rats." His attempt to mock the situation faltered as the room temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the air. Mia, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, pressed on. "Who are you?" The planchette raced across the board, its movements confident and chilling as it spelled "Watcher." Before they could process this, it moved again, spelling out "Beware." Lucy pulled her hands back as if burned. "This is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this." Her eyes darted around the dimly lit attic, half expecting to see a manifestation of their unseen communicator. But Mia, adrenaline coursing through her veins, persisted. "What should we beware of?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In response, the lights flickered. A gust of wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere, deep within the bowels of the house, something thudded, heavy and ominous. The planchette spelled out one final word before they could regroup. Everything. In that moment, the game changed. What started as a dare among friends morphed into a terrifying intrusion into the unknown, the unearthly. The attic, with its shadows and secrets, felt suddenly alive, watching, waiting. As the echo of that last message reverberated through their minds, the real horror settled in. They were not alone. Action beat 3. Breaking the session. The tension in the room congealed into a thick, palpable fear as the whispers of everything hung in the stale air. Lucy's hands shook as she reached toward the board, intent on ending this nightmare. "We need to say goodbye. Now." Her voice was a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had embraced the room. Hesitantly, they placed their fingers back on the planchette, urging it towards goodbye. But as if seized by an unseen force, the planchette resisted, snapping back to the center of the board. Ethan's usual composure frayed. "It's not letting us leave." Mia's eyes, wide with fear, darted towards the board again. "We have to try again, together." With collective resolve, they pushed against the resistance, but the planchette spiraled out of control, spelling out "stay" over and over, each iteration more forceful than the last. Action beat 4. Unnatural phenomena. As their struggle with the board intensified, the storm outside crescendoed in tandem. Thunder boomed, as close and as loud as artillery fire, shaking the old house to its bones. The lights flickered more violently, succumbing intermittently to darkness. Their only illumination, the bursts of lightning that painted the room in stark, ghostly white. From the shadowed corners of the attic, The creaks and groans of the house sounded ominously like stealthy steps creeping towards them. Ethan, usually the skeptic, whispered fearfully, "We need to stop. Something's not right." Ignoring his pleas, Mia, driven by a desperate need to end this correctly, pushed the planchette with trembling fingers. "Goodbye. We need to say goodbye." Action beat 5, forceful termination and immediate aftermath. Finally, with a surge of collective effort and fear-induced adrenaline, they managed to drag the planchette to goodbye. The moment it touched the word, the board seemed to release them, the planchette falling lifeless under their fingers. Instantly, the room brightened slightly as the light steadied, and the thunder outside muted to a distant grumble. Panting, hearts pounding in their chests like war drums, the friends staggered back from the board, eyes wide and disbelieving. "We're done," Lucy declared, voice trembling, eyes not leaving the board as if it might jump to life again. They packed the board back into its box with hands that could barely coordinate, shoving it into the darkest corner of the attic. Descending the attic stairs, each step took them further away from the darkness above, but did nothing to alleviate the darkness that had settled inside them. Once downstairs, the atmosphere was starkly different. The familiar seemed foreign, each shadow a lurking threat. They huddled together in the living room, not speaking, each lost in their thoughts haunted by the reality of what they had experienced and the lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't closed the session as thoroughly as they hoped. Action beat 6, lingering presence and first predictive manifestation. In the days that followed, a palpable sense of unease enveloped Mia, Ethan, and Lucy. The comfort of daylight brought little relief. Mia was the first to notice the subtleties. Her keys would vanish, only to reappear in places she'd never put them. Photos seemed slightly askew. Windows would be found open when she was certain she had closed them. It was unsettling, but nothing she couldn't rationalize away until the first prediction came true. It happened to Lucy. The board had warned, lost soon. 2 weeks later, her grandmother, who had been in perfect health, suddenly passed away. The shock sent ripples of dread through the trio, a chilling reminder of the board's ominous power. Their skepticism waned under the growing weight of inexplicable occurrences, each event binding them tighter in a web of fear. Action beat 7, confrontation and desperate search for resolution. Determined to sever this connection, they reconvened at Mia's house, their expressions grim. "We need help," Ethan declared, his usual skepticism drowned by the tide of recent events. They contacted a local medium, known for her expertise in the paranormal, hoping she could close what they now believed to be an open portal to the spirit world. The medium, a stern woman with penetrating eyes, arrived with an air of solemnity. She set up in the living room, the same room where they had played with the board. Her rituals were intense, involving chants and various esoteric paraphernalia. As she worked, the air grew thick, the edges of the room dimming as if shadows were leaning in, suffocating the light. Her face contorted in concentration, then suddenly relaxed. "It's done," she sighed, "but be wary. Some doors once opened may never close fully." Ending, an unending haunting life returned to a semblance of normality, but the edges of their reality remained frayed. Mia continued to feel watched, an unseen presence lingering just out of sight. Ethan, once a fierce skeptic, now jumped at shadows, his demeanor forever altered. Lucy kept finding mysterious notes in her handwriting that she didn't remember writing. Warnings, apologies, pleas. Mia lay awake most nights, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. They were subtle, almost loving, a sinister lullaby that promised this was far from over. Each whisper a reminder of the board's final vindictive message: stay. The realization haunted her. They had invited something into their world that reveled in lingering just beyond the veil of visibility, never revealing itself entirely, always watching. The Ouija board had not been a mere game. It had been a doorway. And Mia knew, with dreadful certainty, that some doors once opened might whisper forever. The wind howled like a mourning ghost as we approached the old Walbrook cabin, its silhouette a gnarled shadow against the blood moon. I've never believed in the supernatural. To me, the world had enough horrors in the mundane: debt, disease, heartbreak. But that night, pushed by the spirit of Halloween and the thrill of myth, our game was set against a backdrop of whispered legends, the cabin's chilling history setting my nerves on edge despite my skepticism. Our group, festooned in various arrays of ghoulish and glamorous costumes, filled the rustic living room, warmed by the crackling fire. Mark, ever the heart of our circle, draped his arm around my shoulders, half costumed as a makeshift werewolf. Elise, swathed in her ethereal white gown that made her look like a specter out of a Victorian novel, was setting up the board. "Come on, Jamie, it's just a bit of fun," she cooed, sensing my hesitance. Her fingers, adorned with silver rings that glittered in the firelight, trembled slightly as she placed the planchette on the board. "Fun," I muttered, "is not the word I'd use for inviting spirits." Action beat 1. As the candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows, we circled around the board. The game began innocently enough. "Is there anyone there who wishes to speak to us?" Elise asked, her voice a mix of feigned theatricality and genuine curiosity. The planchette was still for a heartbeat too long, stirring an uncomfortable anticipation. Then, slowly, it crept towards yes. A collective gasp echoed around the room, each of us exchanging glances, questioning who might be pushing it. "This isn't funny," I said, looking especially at Mark, who was trying hard to suppress a grin. "Wasn't me," he replied, eyes wide with feigned innocence. Elise's hand hovered above the planchette, her pulse visibly quickening at the wrist. The air felt suddenly colder, the fire's warmth retreating as if afraid. Action beat 2. Mark, intrigued or simply unwilling to let the game end on a possibly dishonest note, leaned forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically serious. We watched, breaths held, as the pointer moved again, this time with purpose, spelling out EZRA. "Ezra?" Elise whispered, confusion knitting her brows. None of us knew an Ezra. It wasn't a name we expected, a name devoid of any connection or meaning to us. Yet it seemed to throb with an unseen significance as it hung in the air. The room chilled further, as if Ezra's name brought an invisible frost. The flickering shadows seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the name or perhaps fueling its power. I could see Elise's fascination shift towards apprehension, her earlier enthusiasm dimmed by the unexplainable cold and the unknown entity named Ezra. I felt it too, a prickle at the back of my neck, a whisper in the dark recesses of my thoughts. This was no longer just a game. This was something far beyond and perilously close to real. Action beat 3. The candles snuffed out suddenly, as if a brisk wind had swept through the cabin. Darkness enveloped us, the only light emanating from the dying embers of the fireplace. Panic threaded through my veins like ice water. "Okay, joke's over," I said, my voice quivering more than I cared to admit. "Let's light the candles again. This isn't funny anymore." But Mark was motionless, his gaze fixated on something over my shoulder. "Do you feel that?" he murmured, and without waiting for an answer, his large hand grasped the planchette, moving it in a desperate plea for continuation. "What do you want?" he asked the darkness. As if compelled by an unseen force, the planchette scurried across the board to the top right corner, forcefully pointing at goodbye. But as quickly as it moved there, it jerked back to the center. "Not alone." The words echoed in my head, though they were unspoken, a sinister whisper amongst the shadows. Action beat 4. The faint glow from the fireplace flickered back to life, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Elise whimpered softly beside me, her earlier excitement now drowned in genuine fear. "We should really stop," she stammered. Ignoring her, Mark pressed on, fueled by a mixture of fear and fascination. "Why are you here?" His finger trembled on the planchette, which whooshed across the board, spelling out, "Always here." That revelation sank into our skins, cold and unwelcome. Mark finally pulled his hand back as if burned, eyes wide with dawning horror. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with an unvoiced terror, as if the cabin itself held its breath. Shadows seemed to creep closer, the normal creaks and groans of the old wood, now sinister in our ears. Had we awakened something that lay dormant? Or had it always been lurking just beyond the veil? Action beat 5. I stood abruptly, the need to flee overwhelming. "We're done with this," I asserted, my voice a mix of command and plea. As if in response, a cold gush of air swept through the room, sending shivers down our spines. Elise nodded, eager to end the nightmare. Together we began to clean up, but the feeling of being watched never abated. Each shadow seemed a cloak for unseen eyes, each whisper of the wind a veiled threat. As we gathered the board, an unmistakable sound of something scratching against the cabin wall froze us in place. The sound was deliberate, unnerving, like a reminder that what we contacted might never intend to leave. We exchanged looks of silent agreement beneath the oppressive weight of our fear. This night had evolved from a Halloween game into a haunting none of us could explain or escape. The sudden harsh reality that perhaps some doors once opened are not meant to be closed loomed over us, as tangible and oppressive as the darkness around. A week had passed since that fateful night, yet the shadows in my apartment seemed darker, more insistent. Sleep became a stranger to me, every creak a call from that unseen entity, every whisper of wind a soft murmur in the guise of Ezra. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching, waiting. My camera captured orbs and misty figures in places where there should only be dust and light play. Desperate for a solution, we regrouped at Mark's suggestion. This time, with the solemn intent to sever whatever ties we had unwittingly created. The cabin loomed ominously as we approached, the setting sun casting a bloody hue over it, like a bad omen. With trembling hands, we reassembled, the Ouija board before us once more. "We are here to make amends," Elise spoke up, her voice stronger than her pale visage suggested. Action beat 7. The planchette twitched immediately to life, dragging our fingers with it as it moved with purposeful jerks across the board, spelling out, "Too late." The very air around us dropped in temperature, and our breaths materialized in shaky puffs of vapor. "No, it has to leave," Elise cried out, tears streaming down her cheeks as her earlier resolve crumbled. "I'm sorry," it spelled out next, the planchette's movements slow, almost sorrowful. But the reason behind the apology remained ambiguous. Was it mocking us or genuinely expressing remorse? Eager to end this, Mark pressed, his voice gritty with fear. "What do you want from us?" "Already here. Always here," it responded again. And it dawned on us then with chilling clarity. The spirit wasn't confined to the board or the cabin. It was part of this land, perhaps even bound to us who had called it forth. Ending. We left the cabin with heavier hearts, an unspoken understanding settling among us like dust after a storm. Our frivolous game had altered the fabric of our reality, intertwining our lives with something ancient, something omnipresent. There was no goodbye to be had, no closing of gates. We had peeled back a veil that was meant to stay closed. That night, as we went our separate ways, the world seemed a different place. Shadows clung a little closer, and the wind carried voices from the threshold of hearing. Lives once ordinary now carried the burden of the extraordinary, the horrific. We learned to live with the whisper of Ezra in the chilling winds, the flicker of inexplicable shadows from the corners of our eyes, and the unsettling certainty that some presences, once acknowledged, refused to be forgotten. Haunted but adapting, we found solace in each other, bonded by a shared haunting that none could fully understand but us. Our lives continued, each day overshadowed by the eerie knowledge of our unwelcome companion, always whispering just across the veil, "Already here, always here."
It started as a game, a test of courage and skepticism. But the Ouija board opened more than just a line of communication. It revealed our darkest fears and secrets, and invited something in that refused to leave. I still remember the cold autumn evening when we stepped into the deserted mansion that Ella had recently inherited from a distant relative. It was supposed to be a weekend of exploration and bonding for our close-knit group of friends. The mansion was perched on a lonely hill, surrounded by withering gardens that whispered the ancient secrets of the estate. As we set up our makeshift camp in the grand living room, Drew, always the explorer, stumbled upon a dusty, old box under a creaky floorboard. With a mixture of enthusiasm and reverence, he eased open the lid to reveal the weathered Ouija board. Its wood was darkened with age, and the alphabet letters were faintly visible in the dim candlelight we had arranged around the room. "Let's give this a whirl, shall we?" Drew suggested, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I remember feeling a chill draft that seemed to emanate from the board itself as we gathered around, our fingers lightly touching the wooden planchette. I was skeptical. a firm disbeliever in anything that couldn't be explained by reason or science. This, I told myself, was just a bit of fun, a story to tell. "Is there anyone here with us?" Mia asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and mock seriousness. To our collective astonishment, the planchette stirred, sliding with an eerie smoothness across the board. It inched towards yes, and I felt a cold shiver travel down my spine, despite my internal protests that it was just one of us moving it, perhaps subconsciously. Drew laughed, breaking the tension momentarily. "All right, who's the prankster?" No one admitted to it, and our initial amusement began morphing into a genuine unease. We continued, each of us throwing questions into the gloomy air, the flickering candles casting long, sinister shadows against the walls. The atmosphere thickened when the board started spelling out names and dates, details that were chillingly personal and unknown to others in the room. "Who are you?" Ella finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, her usually bright face pale in the candlelight. The planchette moved again, slowly and deliberately, to spell out the Watcher. At that moment, the room felt colder, as if the darkness itself was soaking up all the warmth. The candles flickered as though agitated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just invited something into our circle, something ancient and malevolent. In the days following our unsettling encounter with the Watcher, our group couldn't quite return to normalcy. I began poring over old texts and internet forums, looking for any mention of such a spirit, while my friends experienced disturbing phenomena that echoed the ominous forewarnings of the Ouija board. Ella, who had been the most invested in the session, reported her dreams were plagued by shadowy figures whispering in indecipherable tongues. Drew confessed to seeing fleeting shadows in his peripheral vision, vanishing as soon as he turned to look. Mia, ever the enigma, remained unusually quiet about her own experiences, but her dark-rimmed eyes suggested more sleepless nights than not. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I finally stumbled upon an obscure passage in a dusty library book that referred to the Watcher as a guardian spirit turned malevolent, known for its psychological torture of those who dared to summon it. It thrived on fear and could only be banished by confronting it with a united front and a strong, fearless intent. Realizing the severity of our situation, I gathered everyone at my apartment to share my findings. The mood was tense. Mia was the last to arrive, her usual confident stride replaced with hesitant steps. "We need to finish what we started," I declared, spreading out my notes on the coffee table. "According to this," I pointed to the book, "we can banish the Watcher, but we need to do it together. And we need to be absolutely sure no one is holding back any secrets." Ella immediately agreed, her voice tremulous. Drew nodded, clenching his jaw in silent resolve. It was Mia who hesitated, her gaze fleeting and unsure. After a moment that stretched taut with suspense, she finally spoke. "There's something I haven't told you," Mia confessed, her voice a mix of fear and shame. "I've been experimenting with the occult, trying to contact spirits. I thought I could control it, that it would be harmless. I never imagined it would go this far." The room chilled with her admission, betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Doubt and fear clenched my chest, but anger quickly followed. "You brought this upon us, Mia?" I managed to say through gritted teeth, my hands trembling with a mixture of emotions. Mia nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand the forces I was meddling with, but I've learned of a ritual from an old grimoire that might help us close the door we've opened. If you're willing, I need all of you to help perform it." The decision to trust Mia again was difficult, but our desperation to rid ourselves of the Watcher overruled any hesitations. We agreed to meet at the mansion once more, the site of our original folly, to perform the ritual and confront the spirit with newfound knowledge and a resolve to end the haunting once and for all. As we prepared, the gravity of our task weighed us down, but the determination to reclaim our lives drove us forward. Under the heavy cloak of twilight, we returned to the old mansion, each of us carrying the burden of the past day's torments and the hope that this night would bring an end. As we set up the ritual space in the same room where we first encountered the Watcher, Mia directed us with instructions from the old grimoire. Candles formed a circle around us, and symbols were drawn meticulously on the floor with chalk. "Everyone, join hands," Mia commanded, her voice steadier now, eyes locked on the flickering flames that cast eerie shadows on the walls. We must invite the spirit here once more, confront it together, and sever its link to our world. Drew, Ella, and I exchanged nervous glances but clasped each other's hands tightly. The chanting began, led by Mia, the foreign, ancient words hanging in the air like a thick fog. As the intensity of the ritual built, the candles flared wildly, reacting to the energy we summoned. Suddenly the temperature dropped, breaths turning to visible mist as the familiar sense of dread filled the room. The planchette on the board began to move violently, circling the letters quickly, spelling out, "Watching." "We're not afraid of you," I shouted over the din, feeling a rallying strength from the united front we presented. "You have no power over us." "Leave this world," Ella cried out, her voice tinged with both fear and defiance. The wind inside the room whipped into a frenzy, the candles flickering dangerously, nearly extinguished as the shadows seemed to press in around us. Mia continued the incantations, louder and more forceful, the rest of us echoing her words, our combined wills targeting the unseen foe. Then, as sudden as a snap, the room stilled. The candles extinguished themselves, leaving us in utter darkness, the oppressive weight of the presence gone. Silence enveloped us, heavy and profound. We fumbled for lights, hearts pounding, unsure if we had succeeded or merely angered the spirit further. As the lights flickered on, relief slowly washed over us when nothing more than our anxious faces met our eyes. "It's over," Mia muttered, a mix of hope and exhaustion in her voice. We left the mansion soon after, the dawn just beginning to break, painting a soft glow that felt like a new beginning. As we walked away, I couldn't help but feel the lingering doubt, the slight unease that perhaps all was not resolved. Over the following weeks, life seemed to return to normal, yet small, inexplicable occurrences kept me questioning. A shadow darting just out of sight, a whisper carried on the wind, a planchette, slightly out of place, trivial, possibly imagined, but enough to remind me that some doors once opened might never be fully closed. Each subtle anomaly a whisper from the void, asking if the watcher was ever really gone, or merely biding its time, silently observing from the shadows.
What began as a whisper through an old Ouija board ended as a shout into the abyss of our haunted lives. It was supposed to be a mere housewarming, kindled by laughter and old friendships, in an aged, run-down house Michael had recently fallen into owning. The house, a somber relic perched on the skirts of town, seemed like any other fixer-upper, cloaked in the charm of untold stories and a looming, undefined past. How deliciously naive we were, gathered there, adrift in our jovial ignorance. As night unfurled its dark wings, the air inside grew unexpectedly chill, despite the dying warmth of the summer day. Michael, always the host with the most, led us on an impromptu tour. The house was an eclectic mix of outmoded furnishings and long corridors that whispered secrets in every creaking wooden floorboard beneath our feet. And then, in the dusty shadows of the attic, amidst discarded boxes and faded newspapers, we found it, a Ouija board, its surface layered with the grime of neglect, yet undeniably beckoning. Its mere presence twisted our light-hearted adventure into a spine-chilling script. "Let's give this a whirl, shall we?" Michael chuckled, his eyes glittering with a mix of excitement and the unvoiced thrill of the forbidden. His sudden proposal hung in the stale air, heavy like a premonition. Reluctantly, yet somehow inevitably, we gathered around the forgotten oracle. The board felt strangely cold under my fingertips as we placed them lightly upon the planchette. Skepticism breathed within me, but the atmosphere, heavy with the musky scent of old wood and the unknown, painted strokes of doubt across my rational mind. Emily, her face pale and her voice barely a whisper, echoed the discomfort I felt. "Are we sure about this?" she murmured, her fingers trembling slightly upon the wooden heart that promised to dance with spirits. But fueled by Michael's jest and the magnetic pull of the unknown, we proceeded. With a collective, deep breath that seemed to draw the remaining warmth from the room, we asked our first question into the expectant silence. "Is anyone there?" The planchette stirred, slow and almost begrudging at first, before it slid with a purpose we could not ascribe to any among us. Neveralone. The letters were spelled out with methodical certainty, and as the reality of the response settled upon us, An icy draft slipped through the room, punctuating the board's eerie declaration. Laughter broke out nervously amongst us, a countercharm to the creeping dread that sought to root in our hearts. But even as we chuckled, the room's temperature dipped further, enough for our breaths to cloud in brief spectral puffs. Faint but distinct, whispers shuffled through the shadows, as though the house itself responded in hushed tones. Michael's voice trespassed the growing apprehension, still laced with false bravado. "It's just a draft. Old houses like this are full of them," he declared, though his eyes darted uneasily around the dimly lit attic. Our session with the board was only beginning, but the narrative of our night had irreversibly shifted, veering into a suspense none of us had truly anticipated, let alone desired. The planchette seemed to move with more urgency now, as if driven by an unseen force that grew bolder with each of our heartbeats. In the dim candlelight, our shadows played grotesque dances across the walls, creating a haunting spectacle that mirrored the turmoil brewing within us. "Ask it something else," Emily's voice quivered, a stark contrast to her initial curiosity. "Something we couldn't know, to prove." Her voice trailed off, uncertain. Summoning a facade of courage, Michael leaned in, his voice a mix of challenge and fear. "All right, if you're really not just a draft, tell us something we don't know. Show us you're here." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the entire room felt as though it plunged several degrees into iciness. The candles flickered violently as if protesting against an encroaching darkness. We all drew a sharp breath, bracing against the biting cold when a new horror unfolded before us. The windows began to steam up from no discernible source, and as we watched, words started to appear on the fogged glass. "AELPUS," they read, scrawled as though fingered by an invisible hand. The room fell silent, the only sound our synchronized heartbeats thudding against the oppressive thick air of the attic. Fear solidified like ice within my veins, paralyzing, as the stark reality of our encounter descended upon us. In a chaotic burst of fear, we collectively agreed to push the planchette to goodbye. But instead of complying, it began to dart across the board in a maddening flurry of letters, spelling nothing coherent, an apparent testament to the turmoil we had unwittingly unleashed. The candles snuffed out suddenly, casting us into near darkness, saved only by the moonlight leaking around the shades of the now fogged windows. Panic, thick and palpable, filled the room as Emily whimpered softly beside me. "Enough," I declared, my voice cracking as I pulled my hand back from the planchette, breaking the circle. An eerie silence followed, dense and suffocating, as if the house itself held its breath. Then, from somewhere within its bowels, a loud bang resounded, making us all jump. We exchanged wide-eyed looks, the realization dawning that none of us was eager to see what had caused the sound. Michael, his humor now completely extinguished by fear, took charge. "We need to check this out. It could be something serious," he murmured, more to convince himself than us. With hesitant steps, we descended into the lower levels of the house, each creak of the floorboards sounding a sinister note. Our small procession was plagued by an unspoken dread, each shadow and sound magnified by our frazzled nerves. The search led us upstairs, where the bang had seemed to emanate from. The corridor felt endlessly long as we approached the last room. Emily clung to my arm, her earlier premonitions replaced by tangible terror. Reaching the door, Michael pushed it open, revealing nothing but an old, empty room, dust dancing in the beam of his flashlight. But it wasn't the emptiness that captured our attention. It was the absence of our friend Jake, who we suddenly realized was no longer behind us. "Jake?" Michael called out, his voice echoing slightly, betraying his feigned calm. There was no reply, just the heavy silence that now seemed as much a part of the house as its wooden beams. As we turned to retrace our steps, a growing dread filled me. What started as a game had spiraled into a nightmare, one that had just taken an inexplicably darker turn. Our footsteps echoed ominously as we retraced our path, the atmosphere dense with the weight of our collective dread. The realization that Jake was missing turned our already rattled nerves into brittle, frayed edges of panic. We called out his name repeatedly, our voices bouncing off the stark, unanswering walls of the old house. The search led us back to the attic, the heart of our nightmare, where the air felt even heavier, charged with a palpable sense of foreboding. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, the dimness inside swallowing up the weak light from our flashlights. And there in the far corner of the room was Jake. He sat on the dusty floor, his back against the wall, mumbling incoherently. His eyes, when he lifted them to ours, held a hollowed-out fear that sent chills down my spine. "He keeps talking about a pact," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him. Listening closely, I caught snippets of Jake's mumblings, words strung together with a frantic, desperate energy. The owner, he promised, never alone, always spirits to take. The implications of his words were a chilling revelation. The previous owner's entanglements with the spirit world, it seemed, had left a lingering, malevolent presence in the house, one that was not confined to the dusty old Ouija board. Gathering our resolve, we decided to leave the house immediately. Ignoring the whispers that seemed to cling to our heels, we half-dragged, half-carried Jake outside, into the cold clarity of the night air. As we looked back at the looming silhouette of the house, it felt as though it watched us go, its windows like dark, knowing eyes. The ordeal, however, did not end with our departure from the house. In the days that followed, each of us felt an invisible thread tugging us back towards the shadowed whispers of that night. Shadows lingered a little longer in our rooms, and whispers brushed against our ears in quiet moments. It seemed as though the spirits had indeed claimed us, marking us with an unseen, indelible ink. The realization that some doors once opened might never be fully closed was a harsh truth that settled deep within my bones. The whispers from the board, now a cacophony in our minds, served as a constant reminder of the night we reached into the unknown, only to be caught in its cold grasp. As I recount this tale, the echo of that first whispered "never alone" resounds eternally, a chilling mantra for the uninvited presence that lingers still, unyielding, and ever present in the shadowed corners of my life. The Ouija board was not just a game, but a portal, and we had stepped through it naively, irrevocably entwining our fates with what lay beyond. And now we live with the consequences, haunted by the echoes of the damned, a reminder of that night when curiosity drew us into a nightmare without end.
Thunder rumbled ominously overhead as we approached the old Victorian mansion at the edge of Ashwood Grove. The air was thick with anticipation, or perhaps it was dread. You never could tell with these old towns and their legends. Either way, the towering silhouette of the mansion against the stormy backdrop felt like a scene ripped straight from a horror movie, a setting far too appropriate for what was meant to be a light-hearted Halloween get-together. My name is Jackson, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but that was before the Ouija board came out. There was Mark, always the level-headed one, checking his watch as though he had somewhere better to be. Sam, with her wide green eyes reflecting an almost childlike excitement, clutched the old dusty Ouija board she'd discovered in the antique store in town. "No way are we actually doing this," I chuckled nervously, watching her lay the board in the middle of the creaky living room floor, surrounded by moldering books and faded portraits of grim-faced ancestors. "Oh, come on, Jackson! It's just for fun!" Sam insisted, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, high-ceilinged room. She glanced around the circle, her gaze settling on me with a mix of challenge and plea. Mark shrugged, not out of agreement but resignation, and settled down opposite Sam. The flicker of the candles we'd lit, combined with the erratic flashes of lightning outside, cast unsettling shadows on the walls. As we each placed a tentative finger on the planchette, the initial stillness of the atmosphere shifted palpably. A cold draft swept through the room, causing the candle flames to dance wildly, as though they were eager to escape their waxy confines. "Is there anyone here with us?" Sam spoke into the silence, her voice a strange mix of skepticism and hope. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planchette began to glide across the board. My heart pounded in my chest, a skeptical part of me insisting it was one of us moving it, perhaps even subconsciously. But another, deeper part, the part that the shadows of the old house whispered to, wasn't so sure. Action beat 1. Suddenly the planchette jerked sharply to the right, faster than any of our subtle movements could justify. It made a beeline straight to yes. Sam's eyes grew wide, and even Mark's usual impassivity faltered, his brow furrowing deeply. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. "Who are you?" Sam asked, her voice quivering slightly. The planchette moved again, more confidently this time, spelling out Daniel. A chill ran through me. Daniel Hawthorne was the name of the man who built this mansion and who had vanished without a trace over a century ago. Action Beat 2. In the heightened tension following the board's revelation, I noticed the portrait above the mantel seemed to watch us, the eyes of the painted figure, presumably Daniel himself, seeming almost alive. I shook off the ridiculous thought, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As if driven by a force of its own, the planchette then spelled out a new message. Leaveno. Sam's hand instinctively pulled back, and even Mark stood up abruptly, knocking over a candle. Wax spilled over the aged wood floor, and for a moment the only sounds were the thunder outside and our ragged breaths. "Maybe this isn't just a game after all," I muttered, my skepticism faltering as the heavy, oppressive feeling in the room grew, almost as if the house itself were urging us to heed the warning we'd just received. But curiosity, that most dangerous of traits, rooted us to the spot. We had opened a door, and despite the fear that clawed at my insides, we couldn't leave it shut now. Not yet. Not until we understood what lay beyond. Driven by a mix of terror and intrigue, we returned our fingers to the planchette, albeit more hesitantly this time. "Why should we leave?" Sam asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette stirred once more, sliding with an insistent force that made our fingers merely passengers upon its path. "DEBT," it spelled out cryptically. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. "What debt?" Mark demanded, his usual calm demeanor slipping into agitation. There was a pause, the silence so deep it felt like the house was holding its breath. Then the planchette moved again, spelling PROMISKET. Confused and increasingly frightened, we exchanged looks. "What promise? We haven't promised anything," I exclaimed, frustration edging into my voice. A low groan emitted from the walls, or perhaps it was the wind. At this point, nothing seemed impossible. Action Beat 4. The atmosphere felt denser, charged with an unseen energy. The planchette suddenly zipped to goodbye with such force that Sam's fingers slipped off. It was a dismissal we couldn't ignore, yet the impulse to understand was overwhelming. "We need to find out what this means," I urged, despite every primal instinct telling me to flee. Reluctantly, Sam placed her fingers back on the planchette. "Please, tell us what promise." The candles flickered wildly as though in protest, and outside, the wind howled in response. The planchette jerked once, then twice, and began to spell out EACHMUSTPAY. A feeling of doom settled over us, heavier than the humid air now thick with the scent of old dust and wax. "This is messed up, Jackson," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to stop." Before we could respond, the temperature dropped starkly, our breaths visible in the icy air that enveloped us. Action Beat 5. Ignoring Mark's warning, Sam pressed on, driven by a need that seemed almost beyond her control. "Who must pay? Pay for what?" The planchette moved swiftly, decisively. FRTEPAC, it spelled out, then went to goodbye again, much more forcefully this time. The revelation struck us hard. The historical records of Ashwood Grove whispered about old Daniel Hawthorne's rumored dabblings in dark arts, seeking immortality. Could we be the price for his eternal life, somehow entangled in his centuries-old pact with a force beyond our understanding? Frozen with fear, we stared at each other, the implications of our discovery dawning on us. We had delved too deeply, stirred something that had been meant to lie dormant, and now it seemed it was awake and aware of us. The game had changed. It was no longer about whether we believed in spirits or scoffed at the tales of old. Now it was about survival. Action Beat 6 pad in as the planchette's erratic movements became more aggressive. "How do we end this pact?" Sam demanded, her voice quivering with fear. The response came swiftly, each letter slamming into our hearts with the weight of finality. ONMUSTSTAY. The suggestion was horrifying, implausible. None of us signed up for this nightmarish bargain. I scanned the expressions of my friends, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight. It was Mark who broke the tense silence. "We can't take this seriously, right? It's got to be a hoax, a scare tactic." His rational words were a thin veil over the palpable dread that gripped us. Yet, as we debated, the air grew oppressively thick. The room seemed to close in, and for a fleeting moment, my vision blurred, as if the darkness itself was encroaching upon us. Marked by growing desperation, we decided there was only one way to possibly end this: break the board. Clutching the Ouija board, we threw it into the fireplace where the embers were still just warm enough to catch fire. The board ignited with an unnatural ferocity, as though it were eager, or perhaps angry, to be destroyed. As the board burned, the atmosphere shifted. The cold receded slightly, and the oppressive weight that had choked the air thinned. For a moment, we allowed ourselves to hope, to believe that we had severed whatever unholy connection had been forged. The storm outside died down, leaving behind an unnatural, silent calm. We stood in the now quiet room, watching the remnants of the board smolder into ash. A collective sigh of relief was almost palpable amongst us. Yet, even as we prepared to leave, a faint whisper curled around my ear. A whisper without sound, a feeling more than a voice, insisting that this wasn't over. Outside, the first light of dawn was tinting the sky gray. As we walked away from the mansion, each of us was silent, lost in our thoughts. The night's horrors had bonded us in a shared nightmare, and yet, within each of us, the fear remained. Had we truly escaped, or had we merely appeased something ancient and malevolent for now? As I lay in bed that night, the shadows in the corner of my room seemed deeper, more pronounced. Every small noise a whisper from the other side, reminding me of the board's final message. Sleep was elusive as I pondered the permanency of our actions. In attempting to contact the beyond, we had opened a door, and I feared that despite our efforts, it might never fully close again. And so it was. In the quiet moments before sleep finally took me, the echoes of a forgotten pact whispered through my dreams, a chilling reminder that some debts might be too deep to ever fully repay. The rain was relentless that night, pattering against the stained windows of the old Victorian house like a million desperate fingers tapping for entry. Even as I approached the grand, somber-looking archway of Mia's family home, shadows seemed to lurk in the corners of my vision, flitting away whenever I tried to focus. I shivered, not just from the chill of the autumn storm, but from an inexplicable dread that clawed at my insides. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace and the familiar faces of my friends, Jamie, Chris, and Mia, did little to temper the eerie atmosphere that clung to the cobwebbed ceilings and the ancient wallpaper, peeling like dead skin. As Mia greeted me with her usual bright smile and an enthusiastic hug, the house felt alive, as if it were breathing with us, settling deeper into its foundations. Perfect night for our little reunion, right? Jamie's attempt to light the mood was palpable as he handed me a steaming cup of cider. His attempt only half succeeded. It was then that Chris, with his characteristic grin that spelled both trouble and excitement, pulled the cloth off an object on the living room table. An old Ouija board lay beneath, its letters faded but still foreboding, the planchette a silent sentinel in the center. "I found this in the attic," Chris announced, his eyes gleaming with a mix of thrill and mischief. "What do you say we add a little adventure to our night?" Mia hesitated, casting a nervous glance around her ancestral home. "I don't know, Chris. This house, it has history." But curiosity, as it often does, overcame our initial reservations. The storm outside had knocked out the power, and with nothing but candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, we gathered around the Ouija board. The flickering light seemed to animate the board, giving life to the words etched in wood. Yes, no, hello, goodbye. "Is there anybody here with us?" Chris asked, his voice a mix of skepticism and hope. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, our breaths held in a collective silence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the planchette crept towards yes. My heart raced, and not entirely from fear. There was an exhilaration in the unknown, a dark curiosity that welled up from somewhere deep within me. The candles flickered as if in a sudden draft, casting elongated shadows across the wall that swayed like specters. Jamie swallowed hard, his earlier jovial demeanor replaced with furrowed brows. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, more confidently this time, the wood creaking softly under our fingers. It spelled out slowly, Evelyn. Mia gasped, her face draining of color. "That's my mother's name," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and sorrow. She had never mentioned her mother much, only that she had passed away in this very house many years ago. The revelation hung in the air, heavy like the storm clouds outside. Here we were, in Mia's haunted house, contacting a spirit that claimed a name we could not ignore. What had begun as a playful delve into the paranormal was suddenly starkly personal and intensely more real. As the wind wailed outside, mirroring our mounting unease, we knew that whatever game we thought we were playing had changed. We were no longer the players, we were part of the game itself. The air seemed to thicken, oppressive in its stillness, as Mia asked with a trembling voice, "Mom, is that really you?" The candles around us flickered wildly as if caught in a storm, despite the still air inside the room. The planchette moved with urgency now, sliding under our fingertips with a purpose that had all of us stifling screams. It spelled out one word: warning. "What are you warning us about?" I dared to speak, my scientific curiosity piquing despite the terror that set my heart pounding against my chest. Chris's hand trembled on the planchette, his usual bravado waning in the shadow of the unfolding reality. The response was swift and chilling. The pact. Jamie pulled his hand back as if scorched, shaking his head. "No, this isn't right. We shouldn't be messing with this. We need to stop." His voice was a panicked whisper, but his protest was drowned out by a sudden gust that slammed the house, causing the windows to rattle and the doors to groan. Mia, holding back tears, pressed on, her need for answers overpowering her fear. "What pact, Mom? Please tell us what you mean." As the planchette spelled out "renew," the room seemed to darken, the candlelight dimming as if being choked. The shadows at the corners of the room grew taller, their edges sharper, almost menacing. I could feel something shift in the atmosphere, a coldness that seeped into my bones. It was as if the darkness itself thickened, filling the room with a dread that was almost palpable. Whispered voices filled the air, too low to make out, but filled with urgency that made my skin crawl. "Enough of this," Chris finally declared, standing up suddenly, causing the planchette to fly off the board and clatter onto the floor. The candles went out as if snuffed by an invisible breath, plunging the room into darkness. Mia screamed, a sound that cut straight through the marrow. I scrambled for matches, my hands shaking violently. When the candles were lit once more, Chris was nowhere to be seen. The front door was wide open, the storm raging visibly through the threshold, as if it had come alive, angry and howling. "Mia, when were you going to tell us your house needed a spectral pact renewed?" Jamie's voice was accusatory, his fear turning into frustration. "I didn't know," Mia shot back, tears streaming down her face. "All I knew were the old family tales, silly ghost stories. I didn't think any of it was real." The cold seeped deeper, an unnerving silence falling over us as we stood, staring at the gaping door, none daring to step outside into the storm. The house felt no longer just a house, but a living, breathing entity, aware of our trepidation and perhaps even feeding off it. As we gazed into the inky darkness of the night, the reality of our situation settled in. We were part of something much larger and far more sinister than a mere game. A dread-filled silence enveloped the room, broken only by the echoes of the storm beyond the open doorway. "We need to find Chris," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of determination and fear. The need to do something, anything, to break the paralysis that gripped us was overpowering. The three of us, armed with nothing but flashlights, ventured into the stormy darkness. The wind was sharp, as if it was trying to push us back indoors, away from whatever lay beyond in the night. We called for Chris, our voices almost drowned out by the howling wind and the crack of thunder overhead. The search was frantic and aimless. We moved through the trees, their gnarled branches like fingers reaching out to snag our clothes, to hold us back. After what seemed like hours but were only minutes, we circled back to the house, defeated and shivering. The door, which we had left flapping in the storm, now stood eerily silent and closed. The candles inside flickered, as if welcoming us back into the fold of a nightmare. Stepping inside, our eyes immediately drawn to the Ouija board, we saw the planchette had moved. None of us had touched it, yet there it lay on a new message. One gone, pact bound. The air was sucked out of the room as the gravity of the words hit us. It wasn't just any spirit, it was a keeper of agreements, of old, binding pacts that required something or someone to fulfill them. Jamie collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, unable to come to terms with the possibility that something supernatural had claimed Chris as part of a ritual we barely understood. Mia stood frozen, her family's legacy now a curse that had threatened her friends. I felt numb, overwhelmed by the irrevocable change in our realities. We had played with fire, and now we were burned, left to face an altered existence where the veil between the seen and the unseen was torn. The following days were a haze. The absence of Chris created a void that was more than his missing presence. It was as if part of the reality we clung to had slipped away with him. Officials were called, search parties sent out, but no trace of Chris was ever found. It was like he had vanished into thin air, a story that was as unbelievable as it was true. As weeks turned to months, I started feeling a presence, whispers at the margin of my hearing, the briefest glimpses of shadows shifting at the edge of my vision. I moved through days in a fog, haunted by the night we touched the beyond, and it touched back. In recounting this story, I wonder if the pact was renewed not just through Chris's disappearance, but through the imprint it left on those who remained. The board was never used again, locked away in the attic where Chris had found it, yet the echo of its power lingered. As I write this, a chill runs down my spine. The shadows in my room seem deeper, the whispers clearer. It's a reminder, a realization that some doors once opened reveal paths that are walked forever. A pact bound by spirit and sacrifice, a story of curiosity turned to horror, and the knowledge that some answers come at an unimaginable price.